Welcome back. Let's move on to recent global trade tensions. Trade between the United States and the European Union remain a bone of contention. Both sides have suffered from tariffs they imposed on each other. To avoid a full-scale trade war, U.S. President Donald Trump and his counterpart, the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, held talks in Washington on Wednesday. Before we get down to the business of exactly what that meeting meant and the agreement that they wished upon really mean to the rest of the world, let's take a look at what the leaders really have been talking about in that meeting.
The President of the United States.
The U.S. and the EU stepped back from the brink of an all-out trade war. In a meeting between their heads, the two sides agreed on a plan to defuse trade tensions.
This is why we agreed today, first of all, to work together towards zero tariffs. We will also work to reduce barriers and increase trade in services, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, medical products, as well as soybeans. Soybeans is a big deal.
Both sides said they would work to resolve issues with Washington's metal duties. Under the agreement, the U.S. will not follow through with the threat to impose tariffs on vehicles from the EU. The EU also said it would increase imports of U.S. soybeans and liquefied natural gas.
Europe is prepared to work with all like-minded partners to create new opportunities and to improve the global system itself. Whatever future lies ahead, our partnership with the United States must continue to be a driving force for both sides and for the world.
Earlier, Mr. Trump placed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum and threatened to slap new tariffs on the automobile industry. The EU retaliated in kind on over $3 billion worth of American goods. Stung with U.S. tariffs, the EU and another affected American trade partner, Japan, signed free trade deals and agreed to remove tariffs on around 99% of products last week. Despite the de-escalation of tit-for-tat tariffs between Washington and Brussels, the U.S. still facing increasing domestic criticism and counter-duties levied by other countries, including American neighbors Canada and Mexico, and biggest trading partner, China.
For more on the meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Juncker, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhang Gong, who is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir, to our program.
Thank you.
And joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Steve Pruitt, who is a managing partner of Watts Partner, also a former staff director of Committee on Budget of the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome, too. Let me go to you, Mr. Pruitt, first, about the latest trade, not necessarily agreement, but a deal. Is it a truce or is it a peace agreement between the U.S. and the EU?
How about a different term? It's a press release that says we're going to continue to talk, and that it lays out at least an agreement to talk about some specific issues, which I think at the end of the day may well prove good. But I think the problem here is we've been dealing with a situation where policy is being developed by bluff, and you can only do so many head fakes in the international arena before folks start to understand your moves. And I think the script and the likely choreography of a Trump effort here is becoming clearer to our world players.
I see.
I think lastly, we need to stop focusing so much on the manipulation here and what the actual outcomes are. And I think many people in the world have done that, and many sectors of the U.S. economy are now also beginning to focus on outcomes versus the manipulation that they're seeing.
Right.
It's not enough to applaud Donald Trump for standing up, quote unquote, for America. It's more important for him to deliver for America, and I think the sooner we start seeing results, the better off everyone will be.
Got it. Professor Gong, also from Beijing, you are watching this on the sideline, of course, from Beijing. While there's a trade war going on between China and the United States, apparently. Therefore, what does this mean to China, if you look at it as an observer? Is this going to be what Mr. Puig said just a press release or more good things to come, at least for EU and the U.S.?
Well, I totally agree. It is indeed a press release. I mean, look at the substance of this deal they just announced. What the U.S. gives up is the threat of imposing tariffs on German imports of cars. It's just a threat, okay? In exchange for promises of selling soybeans as well as LNG to the European market. So, you know, this is, and there's of course, they say they're going to work on reaching some kind of a deal on the issue of tariffs on steel and aluminum. So, you know, history tells us that this guy, Mr. President Donald Trump, you know, is very good at flip-flopping things.
Yes.
I mean, this can be totally turned around by a tweet tomorrow morning. So, and remember when Steve Mnuchin came to China, we sort of reached an agreement, and he said that we have an agreement. But, you know, when he go back to U.S., Washington, D.C., things start to change.
But, you know, Professor Gong, China also knows it very well. It is not Mr. Mnuchin that is calling the shot in Washington, or rather in the White House, it's President Trump that he insists on calling every shot about everything at any time. So let me come back to our discussion with another guest joining us from the EU countries, one of those. In Edinburgh, we have Kristen Hopewell, a senior lecturer of international political economy at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to our program, Professor Hopewell. What is your take? Earlier, my American guest said it's a press release. Our Chinese guest said, well, this is very skeptical, actually. It could just be a totally different document in the future. So what exactly is it to you?
Well, I think to the extent that this could work to help avert a trade war between the U.S. and EU, that would be extremely beneficial and extremely significant. If we look at the substance of this preliminary agreement to negotiate between the U.S. and EU, it is fairly limited. You know, one of the key aspects, the commitment on both sides to try to reduce their industrial tariffs. The reality is that industrial tariffs between the U.S. and EU are already extremely low, so there's relatively little room to reduce them further. Another major victory Trump is claiming with his agreement is the EU agreeing to consume more U.S. soybeans.
Yes.
But the reality is that that's something that's already happening already because the U.S. is facing increased tariffs on its soybean exports to China, which is its biggest market for its soybean exports. The price of U.S. soybeans has fallen. They're effectively shut out of the Chinese market. So instead, that's made U.S. soybeans at a lower price more attractive in the European market. So we're seeing trade diversion from the Chinese market to the European market with U.S. soybeans. But ultimately, these are things that are happening on their own.
Yeah,
so
but how about liquefied natural gas? That's also one of those items apparently in this deal.
Yeah, and the LNG exports, I mean, this is something that the EU is looking to increase anyways. If you look at the EU is trying to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. It also has its own domestic supply constraints. So over time, they're looking to increase their LNG imports. This is something that will be happening regardless of this deal between the U.S. and EU.
Is it just a matter of convenience, really, Mr. Puig? I mean, we've been hearing since the very beginning, President Trump came into the office, and people have been brushing off whatever he's suggesting or whatever his decisions or his rhetorics. But eventually, some say he's getting somewhere. So can we still be as skeptical about this as we used to be about him or his trade policies?
Well, I first and foremost have an issue with defining what is going on as a policy or a doctrine. I just don't see a plan afoot. It's more of checking a box that something he promised during the campaign to do, and he's going to do it regardless of the outcome.
If that is the case, Mr. Puig, let me put it in another way. Out of the American political context, that is, how would you compare this apparent verbal deal between the EU and the U.S. to the real deal that the EU has signed with Japan when it comes to free trade agreement?
Well, first, it's not a deal. Secondly, there's no dollars reflected in this. There's no quantities reflected in this. all the elements that you would expect to see, quote unquote, in a deal or a contract are missing. It's just, it's not enough substance to really whet the appetite, if you will, in my view.
Okay, and let me come back to you, Professor Gong, here in China. You see the two sides try to continue what they call a dialogue to reduce differences on regulations, standards, and things like that. But the question is, there is a deficit that the U.S. have with the EU 152B, and we do not know whether President Trump, pumping his chest, likely to give what kinds of a solution, and what would this mean, the current situation, for China and the EU to work on the trade issues?
Okay, so let's first talk about your first question.
Go ahead, sir.
Well, you said pounding his chest. Well, that's what he actually exactly did when he had this discussion with the European leaders. And it's in front of the world cameras. He was pounding the table, telling the Germans that they shouldn't have this pipeline to Russia, and Germany being a captive of Russia. And pay very keen attention to the press release today. The EU side said that they're going to build a LNG facility in Europe, provided that the price is right and competitive. So there's actually a lot of strings attached to this deal. So I'm not very sure that eventually really Europe is going to rely on American LNG as opposed to importing natural gas from Russia. This pipeline is still working, I think. It's still under progress. So the deficit issue. Let's talk about the deficit issue from U.S. perspective. The deficit is fundamentally decided by Americans' fiscal policy. As long as there's such a huge fiscal policy, because of this tax reduction, and God knows how many more billions of dollars going to add into the trade deficit, the fiscal deficit, and also
it's
provided that
deficit with all the economies, China,
right.
Japan, the EU, and many others. The list goes on. Having said that, though, let me go back to you, Mr. Pruitt, about one thing. We see this interesting verbal look-alike deal, if you don't want to say it's a deal, that is happening right after, one day after, the Trump administration decided to give $12 billion of compensation to the U.S. farmers as a result of the trade war the U.S. is having with China. It is also on the same day that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, suggested that he's going to delay that meeting he's going to have with President Putin in August, in fall rather. So how should we piece all of these information together? Is this about the really trade deals, or is this about just calming the forces inside Washington, who has been expressing their strong opposition against his presidency over the past 2 weeks?
Well, it's definitely about calming the voices in Washington. The problem is it doesn't respond to the people outside of Washington. And to suggest that $12 billion can undo or in some way mitigate the damage that has already been done is a bit of a misnomer. And I would also suggest that it's probably not going to work because it's not going to be able to be easily administered. And in the U.S., the discussion is already talking about the line that will be forming at the door, if you will, for additional relief. So this is not a good scenario in total. Even to put out $12 billion that we're now going to have to go borrow from our good friends in China to repay at some date in the future. It's not a good deal overall, and that's why politically he's backed off of it.
I see. Professor Hopewell, within the EU, there are a lot of fights going on right now as we speak about what exactly Juncker has agreed to. After all, the EU countries have to all agree about one thing before that one thing becomes official. So what exactly is the political motive for Mr. Juncker going there and say, well, today I want to have a deal with you, and it seems that we are having a deal, at least in the words that he used, Professor Hopewell?
Well, I think this potentially has symbolic value. If it enables this preliminary agreement to negotiate the U.S. and EU, as we've discussed, the substance of this agreement is relatively limited. But if it has a symbolic value in enabling Trump to pull back from the cliff edge of a trade war with the EU, to undo the tariffs on European steel and aluminum, to avoid placing new tariffs on European auto imports, then that would be extremely significant. If this is enough to actually avert that trade war, that would be incredibly meaningful. I think, though, the question is whether Trump is credible, whether he's reliable. As has been discussed, his behavior has been extremely erratic. There's tons of U-turns constantly on trade policy from Trump. So the question is whether he actually intends to stick with this agreement, or as we saw with his, he told us the U.S. and China were negotiating to avert a trade war. He said that trade war was on hold, and then just days later reversed course and is now proposing to put tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese imports. So the question is whether Trump is really committed to seeing this agreement through, to trying to avoid a trade war, or if we're just going to see another flip-flop from him down the road.
I see. Professor Gong, here in China, most people are thinking about, okay, whether a deal or not the U.S. is having with the EU, apparently they're trying to send a message together, at least for now. But what would that mean, Professor Gong, for China? After all, China is in a big trade dispute with the United States. So what's likely to be the message China gets and move forward about this, which is with the United States and also with the EU?
Well, I think that our Foreign Ministry spokesman has said that they're happy to see some kind of agreement reached between the European side and the U.S. side. But I think under the table, I think the government is probably a little bit concerned that with this issues resolved, if it's going to be resolved, that it probably mitigates a lot of burden, a lot of pressure on Donald Trump in dealing with China. And certainly it actually it increases more pressure on the Chinese side. But regardless of what's happening between United States and the European side, and I think that China's trade deficit with the U.S. is a problem that we have to address. And some of the issues that they have raised regarding our China's structural problems are also something in our interest to address anyway. So I think I am hopeful that two sides can come to the negotiating table and work things out. And especially at the highest level between Donald Trump and President Xi. If that's what he wants, let's go for that.
Well, I'm not sure whether the promise you made will exactly be the promise that's coming from the Chinese leadership. But for now, thank you so much, Professor Gong, for joining us. We want to thank the three of you for being with us. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.